Feel free, folks, to say hello in chat, make comments. But if you do have questions, I will make sure to monitor the question and answer portion more, and I will ask Barbara questions. Barbara, would love for you to start out sharing some of your thoughts. Brilliant books, brilliant research, content on leadership, followership. Would love to start out with you first before jumping into some questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, particularly Mahan, for inviting me and having the courage and the guts to talk to me not once, but now twice. We'll see how that goes. We'll know in 45 minutes. But also to the rest of you who are on the call or will be on the call, hello, even if only virtually. And thank you so much again for inviting me. So it is true, as Mahan has made clear, this is a field, leadership, that I have been plowing for many years. And I will say about myself, and if somebody wants to raise a question, you can, I have to say that I'm largely distinct from my colleagues, almost all of them. And I'll give just 2 or 3 examples. One is I focus every bit as much on followers as I do on leaders. I never, ever talk anymore, write anymore, teach anymore about leaders or leadership without equally talking about followers and followership. Another, for example, is my emphasis on bad leadership. And as I look back at my career, maybe even my life, I recognize about myself that the idea of bad, what is bad leadership? What does it mean to have power, authority, and influence and use them in bad ways? That has also been a running theme. And finally, again, I could go on about this, but finally, as I mentioned, I never talk about leaders without followers. I also never talk about leaders and followers without invoking what I call the leadership system. Again, it is a mistake for us to focus on a single individual. For example, we're now fixated on Kamala Harris, obviously. The better way of understanding her, the better way of understanding Trump, number one, is to look at their followers, as I said, equally important. But the third piece of the triangle, it's a triangle, leaders, followers, and the third piece, the third angle, is contexts, plural. The multiplicity of contexts, for example, I'll talk about the temporal one, meaning we are now having this conversation in 2024. I can promise you, if we had had it 5 years ago, not to speak of 50 years ago, or 5 years from now, not to speak of 50 years from now, it would be a different conversation because the context will have changed. The most glaring example of this in the last decade is social media, technology. The impact of technology on the leader-follower relationship cannot be overestimated. So bottom line, my interest in bad leadership, my interest particularly in the relationship between leaders and followers, and my interest in what I call the leadership system, leaders, followers, and contexts, separates me, including a fair amount of skepticism about what I call the leadership industry from most of my virtually all of my colleagues.
Yeah, I love that, Barbara, and that's what I want to touch on, in that you have gone your own way. As everyone writes about great leadership, how to become great leader, there is a industrial complex on helping people become better leaders. You are very skeptical of all the effort that has been put into improving leadership skills or leadership capabilities. Why is that?
Well, I guess I would just look at the evidence, Mahan. What I call the leadership industry is roughly a half century old. Now, people have been interested in leadership since the beginning of recorded history, Plato and Confucius and Machiavelli. But the industry, the idea that this is that teaching people how to lead is a money-making proposition that can be done quickly and easily. You take my course, you buy my book, you come to my executive program. You too can be a leader, or you too can be a much better leader than you already are. There is no evidence for that. It's not as if we look around us and say, oh my God, leadership a half century later is incredibly superior to what it was before there even existed a leadership industry. So if you look, for example, just to go to some hard evidence, at people's, particularly now Western democracies, if you look at people's trust in leaders, their belief in leaders, their support for leaders, and institutions, I might add, which are led by human beings, those levels of trust, respect, support have plummeted in exactly the same, or during exactly the same half century that we've had the leadership industry. So I'm skeptical that I think it can be done. I think we can teach people how to lead. The military, for example, I identify in another book that we might want to talk about as the single best institution organization in the United States that teaches leadership. They do it generally very well, much more than the private sector, much more than the public sector, much better than the academy. And they do it in 3 simple steps, which I can talk about a little later if you wish to follow that up.
I would love to hear that, Barbara, from a couple of different perspectives. Whether it is, a big part of my life was actually in Dale Carnegie training, and we did a lot of leadership development. To your point, I'm not sure in many instances we made a difference. I have to admit that. I do believe it can be done well, but to your point, it's a huge moneymaker, right? I mean, you're at Harvard, the executive courses, educations, everything else come in for 2 days, and now you know how to lead more capably is a big part of what sells the books, the podcasts, you name it. People are seeking, give me the answers. And you keep saying that that doesn't work. Why are we seeking that? And therefore, what works a bridge to what you say the US military does really well?
So they take it seriously. They take leadership, learning how to lead seriously in a way the rest of us, almost all the rest of us, do not. And I will simply summarize very quickly what I put down in a book called Professionalizing Leadership. When it started to dawn on me, that we teach our medical students how to be physicians, and guess how long that typically takes? A minimum of 3 years, typically 4 years of medical school, followed then by an internship, and if you want to specialize, a residency. Guess what we do if we want to train, professionalize lawyers and teachers and engineers? We don't say to a lawyer, take a course, come to my executive program, and you too can be credentialed. We treat those seriously as professions. The military treats leadership as a profession. What is involved in a profession? Again, not rocket science. 3 steps, and these steps in sequence. Step 1, education. You cannot operate on the human body without having studied the anatomy of the human body. Anatomy is a core course in every medical school. Leadership does not have an analog. So you cannot learn how to be a doctor without getting educated about the human body. That's step 1, education. Step 2, leadership. Step 1, then leadership education. Step 2, leadership training. What are the skills and talents and gifts and various know-hows that you need to do for your particular slot or profession? Again, if you're learning how to be a surgeon, you're going to need to learn how to cut, for example, and then staunch the bleeding, for example. In leadership, where are you leading? And here's again where context matters. Do you want to lead in the public sector? Do you want to lead in the private sector? Do you want to lead in a church? Do you want to lead in a synagogue or in a mosque? That matters, because leadership in one sector, one business is not necessarily the same as in another. So what are the skills you need? I call that leadership training. And the third one, and I was very happy to hear you comment on that, which is after your 1-year program, you don't just say goodbye. You have a kind of continuing education. Every professional now has to go through to retain their licensing, their credentials. They must take courses in continuing education. It should be the same for leaders. You cannot learn everything in 2024 to lead, because in 2029, as I said earlier, leadership will require different know-hows, different sets of skills. So leadership education, step one, leadership training, step two, leadership development, step three. It merely mirrors what happens in the other professions. It doesn't, leadership cannot be taught quickly and easily, hastily and simply. It's complicated, and leaders need to appreciate it's not rocket science complicated, but it's a hell of a lot more complicated than quick and easy books, courses, executive programs would have you believe.
It is very complicated, and as you mentioned, the same way in many respects some parts of medicine or law have evolved, leadership has also evolved, and therefore the thinking and some of the approaches through that ongoing development need to evolve. Now, some of your focus has also been on, including your latest book, on bad leadership. We look at other organizations, and we see bad leadership. We sometimes see political leaders and we call it bad leadership. Why did you focus so much of your effort on bad leadership?
I can give you a short answer or a slightly longer answer. The short answer, Ron, is because no one else was doing it. It's the weirdest thing. It's a little like followership, by the way. In that sense, I do march to a different drummer. There are a billion books on leaders and leadership, and like 5.5 on followers and followership, as if followers don't matter. You can't be a leader without a follower. Don't we need to understand followers the way we do leaders? Is there something to being a good follower versus being a bad follower? All that material is somehow been left on the cutting room floor. So the short answer to my focus on bad leadership is about 25 years ago, I looked around. I was in this field of leadership. And I, to this day, find it endlessly interesting. There is nothing more interesting than understanding power, or trying to, and authority and influence. How does one person get another person to do what they want them to do? But why pretend this is all on the sunny side of the street? A lot of this is in the shadows, and we don't have to talk the Putins and the Stalins and the Hitlers of the world. We can talk about bad bosses, which are endemic, bad managers who are endemic. In other words, a lot of people are, I don't want to be dramatic in my use of this verb, but suffering, stressed out because they are reporting to somebody they neither like or respect. And our field, my field, leadership, pays all of that very, very, very little attention. So if you want, Mahan, because you did mention to me in advance of today's conversation, I can read a little bit, maybe 2 paragraphs from my most recent book, which is a somewhat longer answer to the question of why bad leadership interests me. But it's your call.
I would love that, Barbara.
Okay, so here goes. This is from my last book. It came out in March, Leadership from Bad to Worse. Recently, while writing Leadership from Bad to Worse, my curiosity about our demonstrable lack of interest in what I consider a pox on the human condition was piqued anew. Is it even possible that, notwithstanding the overwhelming evidence that bad leadership is an overwhelming problem, the overwhelming majority of leadership experts continue to avert their eyes, despite the consequences of bad leadership sometimes being brutal or even fatal? The answer obviously is yes, especially most damagingly, because it does the most damage, bad political leadership. Why do bad leadership and bad followership merit our attention? Because the problem is as old as human history. Because the problem shows not the slightest sign of abating. Because the problem is ubiquitous. Because the problem is deleterious and sometimes dangerous. Because we are stuck for solutions. Because we invest enormous resources into physical diseases, such as cancer, and into mental diseases, such as schizophrenia, but none into another sort of disease that is bad leadership. In Leadership from Bad to Worse, I mince no words, and now I'm quoting from the book. Bad leadership is a social disease, or if you prefer, a sociological one. But unlike diseases that are physical or psychological, bad leadership remains at the margins of our collective concerns. We fret about it, sometimes we even fixate on it. However, we think long and hard about bad leaders only when they directly affect us, such as a callous manager, an inept administrator, a corrupt mayor, a greedy chief executive officer, or a feckless president. But precisely because we fail to see bad leadership as an affliction affecting the human condition, we continue to suffer it, not so much in silence as in ignorance.
And you know, Barbara, that's beautifully said. And one of the things that, whether it is when Gallup does surveys or others, they see so much dissatisfaction, disengagement, people in organizations not feeling connection, a sense of purpose. Bad leadership contributes to that. But as you say, we don't want to fully address it and think about it. Now, one of the things that connects to that is another point that you make brilliantly about the importance of followership in correction of that bad leadership. Would love for you to talk about the role we all play in enabling bad leadership.
I'll do that. I promise, but I first want to ask, I want to turn the tables on you for a minute, Mahan. How many sessions has, is it do I have the acronym right? LGW?
That's correct.
How many you've had probably dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of sessions on good leadership, how to be a good leader. How many sessions have you all had on bad leadership, or bad management?
Barbara, zero. And I can jump to my podcast as well. I've done over 300 episodes. Yours is the only one that focuses on bad leadership. And I can build on top of that. I literally get dozens of emails from book publicists and promoters. So you take those 300 plus, multiply it by easily by 10. So 3,000. I never get an email on a book written on bad leadership. So I just want to build on that. Zero for us at LGW, zero other than my conversation with you for my podcast, and zero other than your book in the countless emails I get for books being promoted on leadership.
So do you not find that a little odd? I mean, do you agree with me that bad leadership exists?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Do you agree with me that it's not exactly wildly rare? That most of us, by the way, if I ask an audience and I'm talking to a group of adults and I say, how many of you have never had a bad boss? Nobody raises their hand. Everybody's had the experience, or virtually, I suppose I should say, of having a bad boss or manager. Not to speak of if we look around the United States or we look around the world. I mean, we could have a field day, even on this call, discussing bad leaders. So, I mean, I think you would agree that it is kind of all over the place, which raises the question of why. Given that we're so interested in leadership broadly, and given that we can agree there's a lot of bad leadership of various kinds, and I've described the types elsewhere, which we can go into if we want to, given that there are lots of different types of bad leadership, why, I've recently written about this, so I actually have some answers to the questions, but it is endlessly interesting to me. Why? Why do we ignore bad leadership when we can agree that it is in every sector across the board around the world ubiquitous? What is it about bad leadership that we don't go there?
I would love to hear your thoughts, Barbara. One aspect of it, and I don't think I've read that article that you recently wrote, so I would love to hear your thoughts. One aspect of it that I have found is that we have a hard time thinking about bad leadership when it's part of how we approach things. So it's a problem of the other. So if we have a bad manager, we might see bad leadership. When we don't agree on the way the mayor is doing things or whoever is doing things, we see that bad leadership. I do see a disconnect because a big part of my work is with CEOs and executive teams. And I don't think a single one of them want to think about bad leadership because they are all they all pretty much consider themselves to be really good leaders, and in many instances we have another side industrial complex. I joke with my very good friend who is a publisher of a local business magazine newspaper that we have a leadership award industrial complex because all of these CEOs are constantly getting awards because the organizations make money from giving awards. So we don't see it. It's hard to see it. And then we're constantly getting awarded. So the CEOs I work with, they're getting awarded for top CEO of the year, and you name the list. There is no bad leadership. And if there is, it's with someone else, not me.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great response, which, however, doesn't cover the academy. So we've got lots of business schools and lots of schools of public administration or government, and they're dealing with the real world. They're not themselves leaders, as you are correctly and understandably using the term. So why in the academy? Why, business schools, they will do case studies of bad leadership, but it's not exactly central to the curriculum. It's as if you're a medical school and all you looked at were healthy bodies all the time. And you didn't try to have a course that understood how cancer can, prostate cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, whatever, can devour the human body. It's just odd. So I think your point is very well taken, Mahan, that those who are doing it don't think of themselves that way. They don't want to think of people in their organization that way, and other organizations are not relevant to them. Very, very apt reply. But that leaves this whole other area of leadership expert, the so-called academician, wherever they are located, that is equally inattentive, outrageously, screamingly inattentive to this subject. So there you go.
We can talk a lot about that. I want to circle back to the followership part of it, Barbara, because part of your work that has impacted me a lot. This is a second leg that really shifted some of my thinking because we talk a lot about that leadership and the leadership responsibility. As you mentioned, we don't talk about followership and the followership responsibility. So when there is whether it's the high profile cases of the VWs of the world or Wells Fargo's of the world or Boeing, we look at the leadership as opposed to the responsibilities of the followership. Would love for you to talk about that followership and the importance of followership too.
Okay, so thank you for circling back. That's entirely appropriate. So let me say a little about the history of the study of followership before I get contemporaneous, because it's very important to understand. In the wake of World War II, after the Nazi period, a small group, largely of American, well, they were at that point American, many of them came actually from Germany, social psychologists began to ask themselves, this was in the late 50s and 60s, began to shift away from Hitler, let's just talk about that example, and ask themselves, how could the German people, generally described as cultured and in some cases anyway, educated, and with the understanding that Germany had suffered defeat in World War I, there was a Great Depression around 29, so the contextual elements were understood. The Germans, it was very difficult in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, very. Nevertheless, they asked themselves, how could Nazi soldiers, a question that when I'm trying to talk about this, I'll say, how many Jews, let's just say 6 million Jews died in World War II. Then I'll go, how many Jews did Hitler kill? People think for a minute, and then they realize the answer almost certainly, so far as we know, is zero. In other words, those 6 million people were not killed by Hitler. They were killed by Hitler's followers. So, as I said, this small group of social psychologists, maybe a decade or a decade and a half after the end of the World War II, they started to look into the issue of what makes people follow orders. Now, Mahan, you and many in your audience will have heard of the most famous experiment that pertains to this, and it is arguably, if not the most famous social psychological experiment of all time, certainly one. And that is, of course, Stanley Milgram's famous study of obedience to authority. Without going into the details, by and large, he found that if ordinary people were given orders by people who seemed to be in positions of authority, this original experiment was in a lab, and the authority figures were wearing white coats, and they would tell these subjects to inflict pain on other people. A large number of people were willing, just because they were told by this person in a position of authority to inflict the pain, they were willing to do it. So that was the beginning of the study of followership in a very serious and more systematic way. But it didn't go very far after that. As I said earlier, you can go to any bookstore or go online or listen to 1,000 podcasts. You'll find a million on leaders and arguably not even one on followers. But the more I got into it, it relates to bad leadership because, again, you cannot have bad leaders you can't have good leaders without good followers. You can't have bad leaders without bad followers. And I would say it's fair to say that my two most, I've written, as I think you know, I'm not sure your audience does, but many, many books. My two most recent ones, it happens, are about bad followership. Or in the case of the last one, it could be, if things go differently, good followership. But it is about how the role of the follower is critical in enabling a bad leader, whether they are directly carrying out awful orders or whether they're simply doing what the leader tells them to do. So the first book that I'm talking about, this does get political because my bias will come out, but it's titled The Enablers, and the subtitle will give my slant away. How Team Trump flunked the pandemic and failed America. So I honed in on the years of the pandemic, 2021, and I looked at Trump's leadership during that period, especially the year 2020, of course, and I concluded, and this is objectively true, the United States could have done unbelievably better than we did. And I divided Trump's followers into two broad categories. One was Trump's team, the other was Trump's tribe. And I take it from there. Leadership from bad to worse, which we've now mentioned a few times. That book argues that if bad leadership, first of all, bad leadership doesn't happen overnight. It does go from bad to worse. But the earlier it is stopped, the easier it is to stop it. The longer it continues, if the bad leader is not interfered with, we can count on it getting worse. 100% of the time. How does it get stopped? Essentially, briefly put, if followers get their act together. No bad leader wakes up one morning and says, golly gee, I've been a bad leader. I need to change my ways. So it's up to us. It's up to followers. As Biden said last night, it's up to the American people to make decisions about what kind of leadership they want for their country.
Yeah, and Barbara, that is great for us to reflect on the political arena, but also within our organizations. I do want to get a couple of your thoughts from within organizations before circling back to a little bit of that political arena and your latest piece, which I thought was another brilliant piece. I absolutely love reading your writing, Barbara. Absolutely love it. So let me circle a little bit to the organizational side of it. Therefore, folks that are watching this, listening to it, They are leaders of teams and organizations, and or in some instances might be followers within a team or organization. Okay, it is the way it is. So should I leave? Should I, like, what is that? What should I do in order to make a difference? And I'll add another piece to that. The way organizations operate has shifted drastically, while the mindset of a lot of people is still very hierarchical. So I would love
Yeah.
for you to shed some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you made such an important point, Mahan, which you passed over, but I'm going to stop because we have so much language that makes it seem as if they're not so. We talk about teams and empowerment and group action and so forth. In fact, most organizations are still very hierarchical, no question about it. Slightly different from, 25, 50 years ago, but not as different as the leadership literature would have you believe. So the first thing, first of all, in Leadership from Bad to Worse, and every time I talk about anything, I am transsectoral. So every word out of my mouth applies as much to the private sector as to the public sector, as to religion, education, whatever. Broadly speaking, my comments are also about leadership and followership in different countries. What happens in autocracies in Russia and China, even in a middle ground country such as Turkey and Hungary, it's very, very different from what happens in democracies, but they're connected. In leadership, one of the most fascinating parts of it is that everything is connected to everything else. In other words, one of the reasons autocracies have gotten worse in the last decade is because what's happening in liberal democracies, which is that followers are making leaders' lives much more difficult. It's more chaotic. And someone like Xi Jinping wants nothing so much as to maintain order. So what can we do if we're in an organization, a corporation, whatever it is, and there's bad leadership / bad management? So in Leadership from Bad to Worse, I end up giving, I hate doing this, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I do have a kind of a checklist. This is what you should be doing, first of all, to understand your own role, potentially your power and influence to change things. But second of all, how you might go about doing that. So now comes the disclaimer. And I say that in the book. I give all these things you should do or how you should think about this, but I get how hard it is. I get how difficult it is. It is risky. First of all, if you go at the extreme with the whistleblower who's kind of alone out on a limb, whistleblowers more often than not pay a heavy price for speaking out. It is not easy to be a whistleblower, and if you're ever thinking of being a bit whistleblower, you should damn well acquaint yourself with the legal, financial, professional risks associated with doing that. I think these people are brave souls, and I think it's fabulous. But would I ever encourage someone to be a whistleblower? No, because I get there can be, and certainly with some frequency are, serious downsides. Having said that, there are also ways of being politically smart. So in passing earlier, Mahan, you mentioned Boeing. So there is evidence that some engineers, by the way, similar to Volkswagen, I describe what happened at Volkswagen at length in Leadership from Bad to Worse. So in both companies, there were people lower down on the food chain who knew exactly what was happening, that something was going wrong, and they spoke up. They weren't completely silent, but they didn't speak up a lot. They didn't speak loud and clear, like going to the press, for example. And their remarks, their protests were eventually buried. They were buried at Boeing. They were buried at Volkswagen. I am not, again, I want to be clear. I am not faulting these people, these lower level, mid-level employees, these followers, for not risking their bank accounts or their professional status by screaming and yelling about what was going wrong. I think it's human nature. But at least I think we should be intellectually, again, why leadership education is so important, we should be intellectually aware that sometimes organizing and protesting and complaining works, and that the earlier you do it, the less work is involved. The longer you sit and watch bad fester, the more difficult it is to uproot.
And Barbara, to your point, that needs to be part of our conversations as well. I take lots of pride in my Georgetown Business School experience. I still have great relationships with some of my professors who made a huge difference on me and my thinking. While we did talk a lot about ethics, so that part of it was great. Uh, we didn't necessarily think about our roles when we are in organizations, when things are going wrong, what or how that should happen. It was mostly from a positive perspective of leadership and or sometimes financial things going wrong or whatever else
Yeah.
addressing that. So your point is very relevant and resonates in my mind with my education as well. Now there is one other thing I do want to jump and touch on. Your most recent piece, I absolutely loved it. Has me thinking a lot. It touched on one point that is a frustration I find in our conversations, and then you built on it. I'll share with you the frustration is that we glamorize leadership and leadership over management. And I can't tell you how often I hear that, and it frustrates me to no end. And no one, whether in organizations or otherwise, wants to learn how to become a better manager because no manager just do things better, leaders do the right things or whatever, come up with all these like memes that are absolutely meaningless. That said, that's sharing my frustration with all of this leadership is good, management bad. You wrote a brilliant piece on Trump and his management skills, in addition to his leadership skills. Would love for you to share some of those thoughts as well.
One quick question again for you before I do that, which of course I will. Do you distinguish between being a leader and being a manager, between leadership and management? Do you, when you're in your conversation with your CEOs or with people who are in this organization, LGW, do you make a distinction? Do you use the words interchangeably? Do you never use the word? I know this is called leadership, Greater Washington, not management. What, either overtly or even in your head, do you make a distinction between the two?
I do see them as two circles. There might be some overlapping elements, but no, they are somewhat distinct. Uh, there are in the management side, there are, in my view, more there is more process. There is a lot more structure on the leadership side. There is more of a vision, inspiration. There are other elements. So while some of it might overlap, no, I don't think they're the same thing. And no, I don't believe being a great leader is more important than being a great manager, or being a great manager is better than being a great leader. I see them as somewhat different.
Yeah, well, I think that's very useful, Mahan. My only argument, and I would say it to anybody, I do say it, is that when we're talking to people, if we do use both words, probably we should define them, just a sentence or a half a sentence, because I can tell you they're almost never defined. They're often conflated, they're often confused, and it's a shame because it is helpful to distinguish between them and to make clear what we mean with each of the two words. So that brings us back to Donald Trump and the piece that you're referring to. I think it is recognized even by people who don't like Trump or dislike him intensely, that he has been a change agent, a leader of enormous proportions. In fact, I think some people feel that if he loses clearly and resoundingly in November, that the Republican Party has been forever changed and it's not going to revert to what it was before Trump in 2015, 2016 came on the scene. So the phenomenon of Trumpism might, it's not certain, but might outlast him. And he is, in any case, able to inspire and move people and get people to follow his lead in a way that is absolutely astonishing. We must give him that. By the way, to understand it, we must understand the people who are in his thrall, who love him, the people at the Republican National Convention, that if those of us who watched it saw it. They were real enthusiasts. They were not making believe, and we need to understand that. Now, I think because we're so stunned by his leadership, Trump's leadership, we have paid virtually no attention to his managerial skills. He's often denigrated for being a kind of, a New York realtor, developer. The organization is not the Trump organization is not a real organization. It's his family that's running it, or a few people who've been with his father even 50 years ago, etc. But if you look at what he did after his defeat in 2020, and you look at what he did after the January 6th insurrection, where a lot of Americans were ready to nail him forever, and if you look at what he did overcoming innumerable legal, financial, political setbacks, and you ask yourself, how did it happen that he was able, by the year 2024, just within 2-3 years, to make himself the only conceivable Republican candidate for president? There was no competition. There was nobody else out there. That was management. That was his good management. He put together a very small team of highly dedicated loyalists, and they stayed with him, and they built this campaign organization up from the ashes of the defeat in 2020, the insurrection in early 2021, all the setbacks that I talked about. And man, they drove home an organization that is astonishingly successful. And in the piece, I talked about the party platform, how Trump's team was so in control of the party platform that when they got there, the Republican delegates, they got to the site of the convention, Milwaukee, the Republican delegates who thought they would have a say, and maybe a comma here or a period there, ended up having zero say whatsoever, because Trump's team had taken care of all of it. His management was such that nothing was left to chance.
Barbara, that's brilliantly said. And as I was reading it, there are a couple of things I was reflecting on. One is that we tend to take complex scenarios and complex things and try to simplify it. And in that simplification, talk about the cult of personality and or his leadership, as opposed to studying when something is working, as you said. What are the different pieces that are also going into it that are working? That other thing, sort of as an aside, that I love is that you mentioned part of your own worldview and personal bias that you come to it at, but that doesn't keep you from studying it, seeing the pieces, learning from it. And I think it's really important for all of us, because most of my world is a very blue bubble where we don't have the kind of conversations, kind of intellectual humility, and kind of challenging ourselves to really learn and see what is going on. So the second you said the name Trump, I imagine, half the people said, la 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 la, I don't want to hear about that guy, right? So there is an ability for us to study, learn from, and it's only through that we can also then counter some of the movements and some of the forces if we want to.
Absolutely. By the way, for those of us who are interested in leadership, and obviously your audience is, this period in American history has been, a petri dish of experimentation. If somebody had told me, and I studied this stuff in 2016, but I live in the state of Connecticut, the greater New York area, that this guy, who many New Yorkers considered a bit of a clown, was going to be a transformational figure. And if we don't try to understand it. And if we don't credit him for his extraordinary skills, again, managerial as well as leadership, we're never, we're those of us who are not fans are never going to get it, and we're going to be unable to combat it. So I think your point about needing to understand even that which we don't like is absolutely critical here. So I very much support that point. Yeah.
So, Barbara, in starting to wrap up, would love for some of your thoughts and your advice. Leadership Greater Washington, again, is made up of senior leaders who are engaged in the Greater Washington community. Two-thirds business, one-third nonprofit and political leaders. There is a desire and an intention of making a positive difference in the community. That's part of what brings us together. Would love to hear the insights of a woman who has been a leading thinker in the field, leading author, on your advice to us as leaders in the Greater Washington community.
So again, Mahan, the way you're framing it is, how do we make better leaders? But I'm going to, first of all, I want to make clear that my own work is only in part about bad leadership. It's not as if I fixate on that. I am very interested, for example, by the way, this is a timely, I know our conversation is almost over, but I'm very interested, for example, in women leaders. What's gone on with women leaders, and why for 50 years have we made relative, Kamala notwithstanding, have we made relatively little. We've made progress, but not as much as might have been imagined a half century ago. So I look at all kinds of leadership, including good leadership. But I would just say, I would turn given our conversation where bad leadership has been a running theme, I would turn the question around a little, if I may, Mahan. I would say, I think in order to figure out how to be a good leader, we must be willing to look at the whole, at what is good in our organization, and maybe, or in this community or wherever, and what is not so good, and how do we repair that which we cannot repair. We cannot heal a human body unless we know what's wrong with that human body. I would simply say the analog is the same. It's not only about making leaders in a community, let's say, or an organization better. It is also about looking at what's not working so well. Let's try to understand what's not working so well so that we can make it work better. And sometimes this is about people, sometimes it's about resources, whatever it is. So I guess I would simply say, I guess the best advice given this conversation that I could give, Mahan, is to broaden your lens, to open the lens to the whole, not just focus on, let me make this person, this organization, this institution, this group, this community, let me make it better. I would say at the same time, take a look at what is working less well than you would like. And as I said, how to repair it. You can do the way, if you walk into a doctor's office, he or she will look at you, both those healthy parts of you, and try to make them even healthier, but also the parts of you that are less healthy than ideal, and try to make them as healthy as the rest of you. And I would say that is not a bad place to start.
That is a great place to start, Barbara. And I really appreciate you. I've mentioned to you 2003, 2004, you changed my thinking. And since then, you've continued to do this. Yesterday, to one of the book promoters that had sent me an email, I know her somewhat well, so I sent a somewhat joking response. I said if I took out the name of this author, these same bullets of what the author has written about, uh, I could substitute any name here because it's the same thing that I'm getting over and over and
Absolutely.
over again.
I get it.
Your thinking, no one else's name can go up there other than Barbara Kellerman. That's why I look forward to continuing reading your work, including on women leadership. That I could have gotten off that sidetrack and it would have taken us another hour, but we don't We don't want to go there. I would strongly recommend for everyone. Your books are outstanding. The End of Leadership was the one that started me down this path. Your newest one, Leadership from Bad to Worse, on barbarakellerman.com. You write brilliant thought pieces, including this latest one, that I would encourage everyone to read from an unbiased perspective. Divorce yourself from what you think, whether you think Trump is outstanding and great and a savior, or you think he is the most horrible person on earth. Divorce yourself from that. Read Barbara's thoughts on leadership and on management. I'm so appreciative of you. I'm appreciative of folks who've attended. Carl, thank you so much. So awesome seeing you. Carl said, very thought provoking dialogue where my wheels are turning. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you, Carl. Carl is a class of 2012 Busting Loose. We actually come up with a name for the class. This is Busting Loose. Keep busting loose, Carl. Make sure to visit Barbara's blog and her work. Barbara, we are a hugging group at LGW. In addition,
I'm sitting at home, so I'm either denied that or spared it, depending on your perspective. Sweet, I love that. That's really nice.
That said, I will, on behalf of everyone else at LGW, reach through the screen, give you the biggest hug for continuing to make me think and continually to make us think. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mahan, and to all of you who stayed. I know it's not easy to hang around a virtual conversation. Anyway, I look forward to continuing our conversation, and thank you so much for your interest and support. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.